It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. Since winning Britain's Labour Party leadership in 2015, Jeremy Corbyn has faced a consistent campaign of opposition from centrist members of his own party. This has continued despite, or perhaps even because of, Corbyn leading Labour to stunning gains and a near overall victory in the 2017 British elections. Now Corbyn faces possibly his biggest internal revolt yet. Members of his party and prominent Jewish groups are accusing Corbyn of presiding over a rise of anti-Semitism inside Labour.
Today, we gather to say that the Labour Party is a racist party. The Labour Party is an institutionally anti-Semitic party in the grip of racists.
The anger among some is palpable. In Westminster last week, a rally organised by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism.
Well, we can see that this is just the thin edge of the wedge, that what is happening now is exactly what happened in Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
Joining me to discuss the so-called anti-Semitism controversy in the British Labour Party are two guests: Jamie Stern-Weiner, graduate student at the University of Oxford, editor of the new book, Moment of Truth, Tackling Israel-Palestine's Toughest Questions, and Norman Finkelstein is an author and scholar. His latest book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Welcome to you both. Jamie, I'll start with you. For anybody who's not familiar with what's going on right now with Jeremy Corbyn and all these allegations of anti-Semitism inside Labour, can you explain for us the context and what are the main accusations against him?
Well, claims that there is a crisis of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party surfaced in 2015, and since then have dominated the national headlines on multiple occasions. It's actually hard, I think, for people outside this bubble to imagine, but there have been repeated occasions over the past 3 years where readers of the British press might be forgiven for thinking that there is nothing else going on in British politics other than this Labour anti-Semitism crisis. The crisis centres on, its core allegation is, that there has been a significant increase of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and that anti-Semitism is now even an endemic phenomenon in the Labour Party. The only problem with this serious allegation is that there's no evidence whatsoever to support it. Let's look at the evidence on the state of anti-Semitism in the UK today. Every year, reputable polling agencies, Pew, YouGov and others, they carry out surveys asking the British population what their views are about this or that minority group. Every year, they find that about 7 to 8%, between 7 and 8% of the British population have a negative perception of Jews. Now, relative to other minority groups, this is very low. So, for instance, one of these polls found that the corresponding figures for Muslims was 28%, and for Roma, 45%. So the figure of negative perception of Jews is relatively low. It's also stable. It's been around 7 to 8% since the early 1990s. It's also not particular to the left. So if you take a study by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research published in 2017, it found that anti-Semitism on the left, levels of anti-Semitism on the left, are indistinguishable from those in the general population and less than those on the far right.
Right.
Finally,
okay, Jamie, so given all that, what then is going on? Why then are we seeing this charge being hurled against Jeremy Corbyn?
That's exactly the question to ask. If the evidence doesn't support these claims, what's going on? And I think the answer is very clear. In 2015, Labour members elected as leader of their party a veteran socialist, a long-time campaigner for Palestinian rights, Jeremy Corbyn. It was one of the biggest upsets of modern British history, political history. It saw the influx of hundreds of thousands of new members into the Labour Party, and it challenged the grip over the party that had been exerted by the Blairites and by other factional opponents of the left. And what this anti-Semitism scandal has been about has been there's been a coalition of what you could say are two camps. Pro-Israel networks who have used, who have weaponized, who have exploited these anti-Semitism charges to undermine and ultimately to overthrow a person who they rightly view as a principled critic of Israeli policies. There's also been a use of the anti-Semitism weapon by Corbyn's factional opponents within the Labour Party, particularly in the Parliamentary Labour Party. As soon as Corbyn became a front runner in the leadership election in 2015, his opponents within the party, and they used a whole number of kind of smears, attack lines to this end. He was accused of being a Russian spy. The hundreds of thousands of new members who joined the party were alleged to all be Trotskyists, notwithstanding that Trotskyist groups in Britain couldn't fill a phone booth. The anti-Semitism allegations are entirely of a piece with, driven by the same multifaceted agendas as those other smears.
Okay, so Norman Finkelstein, I want to ask you about some of the specific cases that have been wielded here against Corbyn, accusing him of presiding over anti-Semitism and being anti-Israel. But before I do, I mean, this issue has been a main focus of yours throughout your career. Your books, including The Holocaust Industry, Beyond Chutzpah, have all talked about the issue of this use of anti-Semitism as a weapon to smear particularly critics of Israel. I'm wondering if you could just place what's happening now to Corbyn in that context.
Well, certainly the Corbyn phenomenon falls within that broad trajectory of, as the British call it, weaponizing, as I think most Americans call it, instrumentalizing the Nazi Holocaust and anti-Semitism for political gain. And so since the 1970s, periodically you have this revival of what's called the new anti-Semitism extravaganza. So in the 1970s, there was a book put out by the Canadian Anti-Defamation League, which is basically an arm of Israeli propaganda, the ADL. It was called The New Anti-Semitism. In the 1980s, the ADL leaders put out a book called The Real Anti-Semitism, which was about the new anti-Semitism. And then beginning in the 2000s, where Israel's public relations was facing a real debacle, starting with the Second Intifada, then Operation Cast Lead, and Operation Protective Edge. Every few years, we see this revival of the new anti-Semitism as a way to silence, to browbeat, to intimidate, and to terrorize Israel's critics into silence. It is true that in the past, it wasn't always only Israel's apologists that used this claim of the new anti-Semitism. So, for example, in 2002, in the build-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the claim was made that anybody who opposed the invasion of Iraq was supporting a second Holocaust because Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons and that he may use one of those nuclear devices against Israel. Still, I would say that the Corbyn phenomenon is really of a different order of magnitude because it's not just Israel's supporters who have instrumentalized the anti-Semitism and the Nazi Holocaust. It's a quite broad array of forces, including those within the Labour Party, the supporters of Tony Blair. It's the equivalent of our Bill Clinton, somebody who tried to, quote unquote, modernize the Democratic Party by well, the claim, the term, I don't particularly like it, but the neoliberalization of the Democratic Party, and Blair attempted to do roughly the same thing in the Labour Party. So there are the Blairites, but then Jeremy Corbyn, as Jamie said, is a principled supporter of Palestinian rights, but he's also, in addition, and not trivially, and probably more significantly, he's putting forth a very rigorous and tough class platform. He's the real thing. He's an old-fashioned leftist. And so the ruling elites in the UK, and also globally, not just in the UK, the ruling elites, to use Karl Marx's expression in the Communist Manifesto, they're genuinely trembling. This is a potentially a devastating threat to the ruling elites and their dominance over British society, as well as, in our case, American society. And so everybody now is acting in concert. I wouldn't really call it a conspiracy because it's all being unfolding before our eyes. They're acting in concert and ruthlessly to try to stop the Corbyn phenomenon. I would say for American viewers, it's worth watching this closely because I think exactly the same thing is going to happen to Bernie Sanders if he runs in 2020, and he has a credible chance of winning. As your American viewers know, we already saw a preview of that with the victory of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where immediately they zoomed in on her remarks about Israel, in particular on Gaza. Now the same thing is happening in the UK, but it's obviously in a much bigger level. It's talking about the prime ministership of the UK. And as I said, I expect the same thing will happen in 2020 in the United States if there's a Bernie Sanders candidacy. So the repercussions, the reverberations, the implications of what's happening now in the UK, they're significant for all of us. This is a historic candidacy. This is the last great hope of the British working class. And as our global system is polarizing, it's the real first big challenge to the polarization on the right. And if Corbyn survives and becomes prime minister, it's still going to be a really rough battle, but it'll be a huge victory. And so we all ought to pay attention, and we all ought to give our all to try to stop this evil juggernaut, which is instrumentalizing, or in the British expression, weaponizing anti-Semitism in order to stop the Corbyn phenomenon, the Corbyn threat. And I want to emphasize that even though it's expressed in the form of his support for Palestinian rights, it's much bigger than that. It's a very tough class platform. Jeremy Corbyn does not like homelessness. Jeremy Corbyn does not like joblessness. Jeremy Corbyn does not like hunger. But that's not just words at a wine and cheese party. It's in his bones. And he's determined to do something about it. And the ruling elites don't like it in the UK. They don't like it in the United States. And everybody's now, if I can use the expression, they're crucifying the man. There is nothing more absurd, nothing more preposterous than to label Jeremy Corbyn a racist, a bigot, or an anti-Semite. Anybody knows his personal history? This guy has been an anti-racist campaigner for a longer period of time than you, Aaron Maté, have been on this planet. Even yesterday, I was surprised to read that the foreign editor of the Jewish News in the UK, even he said the idea of calling Jeremy Corbyn a bigot or a racist, he said it's ridiculous. It's just absurd, and given the enormity of the allegation, it's obscene.
Right. Okay, Norman, but that statement that you just quoted contrasts with the three leading establishment Jewish newspapers in Britain, the Jewish Chronicle, the Jewish News, and the Jewish Telegraph. They just published a joint editorial called United We Stand, where they begin by saying that they're standing together because of the existential threat to Jewish life in this country that would be posed by a Jeremy Corbyn-led government. Before you respond, we're actually going to pause there. And when we come back in part two, we'll talk about some of these specific allegations that are being made against Corbyn, which include criticizing him for appearing alongside none other than a survivor of Auschwitz, a survivor who compared Israel's policies to those of Nazi Germany. And for that, Corbyn has been attacked. My guests are Jamie Stern-Weiner and Norman Finkelstein. Join us in part two.